Chapter 5. The Long, Hard Trail. A Scottish-Canadian man took Buck and his team now, and they started back along the same old trail to Dawson. It was a very different trip this time, because they were pulling a big load of letters, and it was hard, heavy work. Buck did not like it, but he had pride in his work, and he made every dog in the team pull hard. Every day was very much like another. They left in the dark before the sun came up and camped at night. There were 100 other dogs camping with them, and some of them were fierce fighters. But Buck fought with the fiercest and quickly showed them that he was master. Soon he only had to show his teeth, and the other dogs moved away. After he had eaten in the evenings, Buck loved to lie near the fire, watching the orange flames jump and dance. Sometimes he started to think of Judge Miller's big house in the sunny Santa Clara Valley. But then he remembered the man in the red sweater, Curly's death, and the great fight with Spitz. Often as he lay there, watching his new master cook, he dreamed of another different man. This man was shorter, with longer arms and long hair. He also had hair on his body and wore nothing but an animal skin. He moved like a cat, as if he was always afraid of something, and he carried a long stick with a big stone on the end. Sometimes in Buck's dreams, the hairy man slept by the fire, and then Buck saw black eyes in the circling darkness around him. He heard the noise of bodies moving, and he knew that there were great animals of the night looking for food. Dreaming there by the fire, these sounds and sights of another world sometimes made the hair on Buck's back stand up until he growled softly. That means it scared him. Dreaming there by the fire, these sounds and sights of another, earlier world sometimes scared him until he growled softly. Then the Scottish-Canadian man shouted at him, "Hey, you, Buck, wake up!" And suddenly the other world was gone, and today's world came into his eyes. So Buck is dreaming about 1,000 or 10,000 years before, when humans lived in caves. He's thinking back long, long ago when dogs and man first met, about 10, 15,000 years ago. It was a hard trip with the heavy load, and when the team arrived in Dawson, they were tired, thin, and weak. The dogs really needed a week's rest, but after only 2 days, they were back on the Yukon Trail again with another heavy load. The dogs were still tired, and the drivers were not happy. To make things worse, it snowed every day, so the trail was soft and the pulling was hard. The drivers were good to the dogs, but the dogs were losing their strength. Since the beginning of the winter, they had traveled nearly 3,000 kilometers. Buck kept the team working, but Billy cried every night, and Joe was more bad-tempered than ever. But it was Dave who had the worst time. Something was wrong with him. He became more and more bad-tempered and always found some place to sleep as soon as they camped. After he was out of his harness, he did not get back on his feet again until the next morning. And sometimes in the harness, he cried out in pain. The driver looked at him but could find nothing wrong. All the drivers talked about Dave in the evenings, and one night they brought him to the fire and touched his body in different places. Dave cried out many times. Something was wrong inside, but the drivers could not find any broken bones, and they could not understand it. When they arrived at Cassiar Bar, Dave was so weak that he kept falling in the harness. The Scottish-Canadian man stopped the team and took Dave out of the harness, putting Sol-leks in his place near the front of the sled. He wanted to let Dave rest and run next to the sled without pulling it. But Dave hated being taken out, and he cried when he saw Sol-leks in his place. With his pride in the trail, he could not let another dog do his work. The sled team started to move again, and Dave ran at Sol-leks, biting him and making the sled stop. Crying with pain, Dave tried to jump back into the harness. The driver whipped him to send him away behind the sled where he could run easily. But he would not go. The driver started the dogs again, but the sled did not move. Dave had bitten through the harness and was now standing near the front of the sled in his usual place. He looked at the driver, begging him with his eyes to let him stay there. The driver thought for a moment. Other drivers talked of how some dogs' hearts broke when they were not allowed to work. Some had died when they were taken out of the harness because they were hurt or too old. Dave was going to die, and it was better that he should die where he wanted to be, working. So he was put back in the harness, and he pulled proudly as he always had. Sometimes he cried out in pain, and several times he fell down and was pulled along by the sled. When they camped that night, the driver made a place for Dave by the fire. In the morning, he could not get up, but he tried to pull himself slowly towards the harness until his strength was finally gone. The last time the rest of the team saw Dave, he was lying in the snow, breathing heavily. But they heard him howling sadly until they had gone into a small wood. Here the sled stopped. The driver walked back towards the camp they had just left, and they heard the sound of a gun. Then the man hurried back. The dogs were told to go forward, and the sled moved off along the trail. But Buck knew, and every dog knew, what had just happened at the camp.